Está no ar.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the International Seminars Global Rivers in the Anthropocene. It's a big honor to introduce our today's speaker, one of the most influential fluvial geomorphologists of all time, Professor Gerald Nanson from the University of Wollongong, Australia. For that reason, I will take longer than usual to introduce such a prestigious researcher like Gerald. Gerald is a New Zealander who graduated with honors from the University of Otago, then moved to Canada to complete a master at the University of Alberta in Edmonton on bedload transport in the Rocky Mountains. He then completed a PhD at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver on channel migration, floodplain formation, and vegetation succession in the boreal forest region of British Columbia. I want to tell a funny story about that time. While undertaking his fieldwork, Gerald's camps was partially destroyed several times by the messy black bear that he has to shoot to continue his fieldwork. In reality, he missed the shoot. The bear stayed alive, but he hit and sank his canoe. In 1977, he moved to Australia and worked for 4 decades as an academic in geography and earth science at the University of Wollongong, where today is Professor Emeritus. Through my life, I have the opportunity to meet Gerald many times here in Brazil when he attended our La River Symposium and a great field trip to the Araguaia River. We met also in Peru, Singapore, the USA, and in many other places of the world. And I also enjoyed the long and unforgettable field trip to the Outbacks, where he was explaining us, with Professor Estebo, my friend from Brazil, all the wonderful Australian landscapes. He has been primarily a fluvial geomorphologist, focusing most recently on theoretical research into channel hydraulics. Gerald has also undertaken substantial research into the formation and behavior of desert dunes and into fluvial aeolian evidence for quaternary climate change in arid central Australia. Of course, he's also one of the top 2% most influential researchers of the planet, as recently published by the ranking elaborated by Elsevier and Stanford. Nanson has been a sole or primary supervisor and mentor to 20 PhD students and several postdoctoral fellows. His analysis into the geomorphology and sedimentology of meandering rivers and floodplain has become widely recognized internationally by scientists, engineers concerned with riverbank erosion, channel movement, and also his discoveries have been used by the stratigraphers interpreting the rock record and locating reservoir for hydrocarbons. Among his papers, probably the most famous and more disseminated paper is his classification on floodplains, co-authored with Jackie Kroc, is now his most cited work. Nanson has been also very influential to me as a person and as a researcher, as he is the father of the definition, identification, and theoretical study of anabranching rivers. We together are still fighting with the scientists, with the scientific establishment, to get accepted that anabranching rivers are far from an oddity, but a major representation of fluvial channel across the whole planet. With his prior PhD student and now research colleague, He King Huang, he has developed a geomorphological understanding of the adopted physical principle of least action. greatly simplifying explanation for how, and most importantly, why alluvial rivers are attracted toward the stable, stationary, equilibrium least action state. In other words, why alluvial rivers self-adjust from condition of relatively instability toward the more stable condition. This is to be the focus for his talk on this occasion, presented in a way that will be understandable to geomorphologists or any other professionals with a strong background in physics and mathematics. Unfortunately, we are facing problems, technical problems with Gerald that is in Australia at this moment, so we cannot get his video. We will have his voice, so we are going to get the presentation and his voice with the image. Remember also when you can start to upload your comments and questions in the chat. So please, all the participants, include your question in the chat, and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So, en português, estamos tendo problemas com a comunicação com Gerald em Austrália, portanto, vamos ter a voz dele, mas nós não vamos ter a imagem. Vamos ter a apresentação e a voz dele. Por favor, escrevam todas as suas questões no chat, e nós vamos transferir as questões suas para Gerald. Well, that say, welcome, Gerald. It's a huge pleasure having you with us today. Please go ahead, Gerald, with your presentation.
Thank you, Eduardo. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Gerald. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay, well, probably just as well you can't see me. Okay, well, it really is an honor to be able to speak to you over there in Brazil, and especially on a topic such as this one, which I've been working on with my colleague He-Sing Huang for some time, probably since about the turn of the century, about 2000. And you can see, just checking, am I coming through clearly, Eduardo? You can hear me? Okay.
Yes, everything is perfect. You go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, with my colleague He-Sing Huang, who's in China. He's at the Chinese Academy of Science now. He was a PhD student of mine, and we started this work really at about 2000 was the year that we published our first paper on it. So the topic of the talk, as it's written out there, is lazy rivers, equilibrium theory, channel evolution, least action principle, factors determining self-adjustment in alluvial rivers, and the resulting bias in the Earth's fluvial stratigraphic record. Most of you will have seen this diagram in textbooks. It's an illustration of how rivers change their pattern based on certain characteristics, the gradient of the river, the sediment load, and such like, and they're mentioned on the boundary of that figure. So river patterns have been described as a continuum, really, going from straight to braided and meandering and anabranching. As Eduardo said, not everyone agrees that anabranching are an additional pattern, but certainly most people are getting used to the idea now to include it. So we can say that that diagram on the right shows the present array, really, the diversity of river patterns, and there are about 14 of them on that diagram. Well, some people have said that water takes the path of least resistance, that rivers minimize their work. When you look at that diagram, why is it that so many of those patterns make it, in fact, more difficult for rivers to run downhill. They're not taking the path of least resistance. They seem to be creating resistances along the way. That's really what we're going to look at in this talk. Why do so many rivers create so many obstructions to flow? Well, what are the four primary river patterns that we deal with mostly? Certainly on the top left there, you've got a straight river. Now, they're very rare. People almost never see them and describe them, but the odd one does exist. And in fact, they're quite common in Australia. And of course, as you've got illustrated so well in Brazil, you've got meandering rivers. And if you go back into the Andes, to the foothills of the Andes, you've got braided rivers and those ones that Eduardo's worked on so effectively, anabranching rivers, although that example on the bottom right-hand side is from the Columbia River in British Columbia. So they're the four main types of river pattern. What are the various theories for those four? Let's just quickly look at what it is people have said will make a river straight, braided, meandering, or anabranching. There's really no theory for why rivers are straight. A lot of people start their investigation in a flume by cutting a straight channel. They don't really explain why, except that it's a starting point, and then they'll start looking at river meanders or river braids in a laboratory flume by cutting a straight channel. So straight rivers are quite rare. The only paper that's really addressed why rivers might be straight is the one I've listed there by Huang and Nansen in 2004, where we looked at why rivers adopt certain patterns, why rivers adopt a certain shape, planform shape. The pendulum in the middle is meant to illustrate the point that we're arguing that rivers are straight in their most ideal state. It's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. It has one point of least action, and that is when the pendulum isn't moving and it's hanging perfectly perpendicularly in that central position. In physics, that's the point which has been referred to as the point of least action. In other words, the pendulum is not swinging back and forth, it's adopted a position of minimum action. And that's where the theory of least action is sort of based in a variety of ways, but in the case of a pendulum, that's where the principle of least action is most effectively illustrated. Okay, so we don't really have much of a theory except for the one that Huang and I have put forward about why a pendulum is a good illustration for a straight river. What about theories of meandering? Well, in terms of energy expenditure, if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see that youth, maturity, and old age are the three characteristics that W.M. Davis suggested was how a landscape evolved. And you can see the youthful rivers and the mature rivers are relatively straight and they're cut into valleys. But when a landscape becomes old and the gradients are very low, Davis thought that that is when rivers started to meander. So it was a rather old-fashioned idea. He came up with it in 1898, and it's still quite often proposed in textbooks that rivers will meander once they get down onto low gradient plains and away from the mountains where the rivers are more youthful and or even mature. The second theory is that maybe rivers meander because one bank collapses. It was a straight channel, but a bank collapses and that pushes the flow to the other bank and that causes the river to meander. The third theory is that perhaps secondary currents are what drives meandering. Now, secondary currents are well known to exist in river meanders, They've been measured in laboratory flumes and they've been measured in the field. But in reality, secondary currents are really formed once the bend develops. Well-developed secondary currents don't occur in straight channels, at least not in the form that you see in that diagram. You do get secondary currents, but they're not actually causing the meander. They're actually taking place once the meander is established. The fourth reason that rivers may form meanders is because they form step pools. Now, if you go into the mountains in particular, you'll often see a pool and then a rapid or a riffle as it's called, and then another pool and another riffle. And you can see those illustrations on the top left there of pool, riffle. And the meander bends develop supposedly in the pools to consume energy as water flows through the pool, and then there's more energy consumed as it goes over the riffle and so forth. And this evens out the energy expenditure. This was an idea that Leopold Langbein proposed, and it's been widely adopted and does seem to have some currency in the sense that it does make the uniform expenditure of energy more likely. It does fit in with the pool and riffle sequence, and it's energy related. And the fifth idea, you could say, is really a suggestion by Gary Parker way back in the 1970s. And he suggested there was some sort of infinitesimally small perturbation in the flow. And this perturbation would amplify, and then eventually the flow would start to oscillate back and forth, and you could produce meanders that way. All of these ideas have been put forward to explain meanders in rivers, but the problem with them is that there are meanders in other mediums. There are meanders not in rivers with sediment, which is where all of those explanations are really required to occur. You can have meanders, of course, on tops of glaciers, like those first two diagrams illustrate there. And you can have meanders in the Gulf Stream. That's off the coast of North America there with Florida and the east coast of the USA, and the meanders heading off towards Europe, the meandering Gulf Stream heading off towards Europe. And of course, you can have meanders in the jet stream as well, another fluid, an atmospheric fluid of high energy flowing through the upper atmosphere and in a meandering pattern. Now, none of those required any sediment. So I think we can exclude the fact that sediment is required to form river meanders, or in fact, meanders in any fluid. David Knighton in his book suggested that he remained unconvinced that any explanation for meandering was adequate. You know, the Knighton book, the 1998 book on FLUVIAL geomorphology, and he suggested that his suggestion was it's an inherent property of turbulent flow and not dependent on the presence of a deformable boundary. The deformable boundary merely allows the underlying wave-like pattern or structure in the flow to be observed. Well, he was really saying that none of the current theories seem to apply, and there must be something else. There must be something, an inherent property in the flow. What about theories for braided rivers? We've talked about meandering rivers and straight rivers. Well, the other large category of rivers, not so many in Australia, as we don't have a single braided river in Australia, but you have some, of course, as you head back into the catchments towards the Andes, quite a lot of braided rivers, high energy braided rivers. Well, there are 6 different theories really as to why braided rivers might form, and they're not mutually exclusive. Braided rivers could have be illustrated to show all of these characteristics. Insufficient stream power, oddly enough, excessive stream power. In other words, the two are in fact opposite to each other. The reason for that is that there are, in fact, two types of braided river, and this hasn't been readily understood or explained, except by one paper that I'll bring to your attention shortly. So insufficient power is one explanation, excessive power is another, highly variable water discharges, but there's nothing terribly unique about that. Most rivers vary their water discharge. Even big meandering rivers and anabranching rivers like the Amazon vary their discharge greatly. So there's nothing terribly unique about braided rivers varying their discharge. They do have erodible banks caused by, and that causes excessive widening of the channel. They, according to Gary Parker, also experience infinitesimal perturbations, although these have never actually been measured, they're theoretical. And they, of course, lay down random medial bars, and that's been an explanation for them as well. I just point out to you on the diagrams on the left that there are, in fact, two, if you like, diametrically opposed braided rivers. In the top diagram, that's the Rakaia River in New Zealand. And you can see that it's actually slightly entrenched in that plain. There's a plain on either side of it, which is farmland, and the river never gets up to that plain because it has incised into what is called the Canterbury Plains. And if you take the bottom diagram, that's actually a vertically accreting braided river. So not one that's incising, but vertically accreting. So quite the opposite. That has insufficient power. Now that's located in Iceland. Iceland is a country which is growing. Its rivers, one of the few places where its rivers are actually vertically accreting, at least some of them are, because there's material being produced, volcanic material being produced, which is then reworked along the rivers and deposited along the rivers. So you've got two very different sorts of braided rivers just in that illustration there. What about theories for anabranching? Well, anabranching had previously, before Eduardo and I worked on it, had largely been attributed to vertical accretion and avulsions. And that was because so much work was done on one braided river, the Columbia River in Canada. And that diagram, or those three aerial photos there, illustrate very nicely the Columbia River, forming splays in the top left corner, another couple of splays in the bottom left corner, and a diagram showing how that will accumulate sediment over time. We know now, though, that that's not the case, that not all anabranching rivers are vertically accreting. Particularly in Australia, we have we've got a very large number of anabranching rivers. They're almost the most dominant river type in Central Australia, but they're not vertically accreting. These rivers are highly stable. This is a picture of the Marshall River. It's a highly stable system with no excess or deficiency in energy. And interestingly, and note, it has no bed forms. Now that's very odd for a river. Just about all rivers have bed forms, and I'll get to that point shortly. But the thing about these rivers is that they run in multiple channels, although you can really regard each channel as a separate river because they're quite isolated from the other channel by a line of trees and vegetation and ridge. You can see to the left side of the person standing in that channel is a well-defined ridge. And beyond that ridge, there would be another channel, and then another one, and they're repeated across the valley. So each of those channels operates really as a separate river, and they're running dead straight. So we do have straight rivers. They're just often in the form of anabranches rather than individual straight channels, although I will show you some pictures of straight channels in Australia. The Marshall River is a highly stable system, and we've done quite a lot of work on it and demonstrated that it has this particular characteristic of stationary equilibrium. That is, it's very like the pendulum, which isn't swinging backwards and forwards. It's in a central position. I can explain that a bit further as well. So based on three fundamental points, Wang and I have proposed that there is really a simple single cause for all river patterns, that there isn't a unique cause for meandering rivers and another unique cause for braided rivers and another unique cause for anabranching rivers. They're really all a product of these three fundamental points. The first and really the most important and extensive is that the Earth is a wet and tectonically active planet. If you look at the diagram on the left, the planet Earth is remarkable in that it has about 70% of its surface is made of water, and that is going up into the atmosphere and raining down on the landscape that surrounds those oceans. It's an unusual situation for a planet to have that much water being recycled from large bodies of water and oceans onto the land and running off as it does. The other feature of Earth is it's made of hard rock. It's one of the rocky planets like Mars. So it's got these two characteristics. One is that there's a lot of water being recycled in form of a hydrological cycle, and it's got a very hard rocky surface. Now that means that its rivers are running off the surface, but not actually carrying very much sediment load, because the rivers are unable really to erode that rapidly. So to summarize what I've said there, the Earth is a wet and tectonically active planet. So most of its rivers, if they were straight and narrow, would be greatly overpowered. They would become highly unstable flow systems. This would result in a great deal of instability in the river, both in the water itself and what it's doing to its banks and its bed. That characteristic of oversupply of energy is characteristic of most of the planet, and we'll talk about that a little further on as well, except in large parts of Australia. My move to Australia was a particular revelation because most people had studied rivers in Europe and in North America, where there was a lot of tectonic activity. They had the Alps in Europe and the Rocky Mountains in North America. The Great Plains was quite steep, even in the Great Plains in North America. There's a lot of energy in those rivers. But when you come to Australia, there's relatively little energy in most of the river systems because the continent is so flat. How do we know rivers have too much power? What is it that illustrates that there's something odd going on? Well, rivers, as you know, we can really only talk about rivers in terms of what they're doing at about bank full. That's when their channels are forming, and that's why the channel is the size and shape it is. It doesn't really matter what a river carries on any day of the week when there's just a small amount of water flowing through it. What determines the shape of a river is its bank full channel. And when you see just about any river at bank full, you'll see that it has those large waves in the center of the channel in particular, and they're called standing waves. You can see that diagram to the left of that steep river running through a village in Italy, and an awful lot of turbulent flow, standing waves. And the bottom right-hand picture is an illustration of a canal which is bank full, and you can see there are standing waves there, and you've even got surfers who use those standing waves to ride what is effectively a perpetual wave. It stays in that position, consuming extra energy that the flow has, consuming the surplus energy in the flow. And the other thing that illustrates that rivers have surplus energy is that they create roughness. In other words, rivers develop a bed which will consume some of that energy. I mean, why else do rivers form ripples and dunes and anti-dunes and bars and bends? All of these, as I illustrated in that second slide, are basically designed to consume energy. It seems odd that a system which we've been told takes the path of least resistance is in fact creating so much resistance. I think the path of least resistance has been overstated. Rivers are in fact, in many instances, generating a great deal of resistance by developing standing waves, bed forms, bars and bends. So our first point was that. Our second point is really that, like all self-governing systems, alluvial rivers are controlled by the principle of least action. They minimize their physical action to maximize energy conservation and hence maximize their stability. Imagine if a river was supplied with a vast amount of energy, an alluvial river. I mean, you would see a great deal of instability. If you get an extreme flood event going down a river, the river becomes highly unstable. So what we're saying is that rivers, like all physical systems and many other systems as well, there are theories in economics, there are theories in linguistics, all of which utilize the principle of least action. And that is that most natural systems will adopt a position where they are the most stable and the most energy efficient. An example is a cannon firing a cannonball. Which of those paths does the cannonball follow? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? It will follow the path of least action. What about a ray of light passing through a block of glass? So that red ray of light coming down, or a laser, when it hits the block, rather than traveling straight through it, it takes the path of least action. It actually passes through the block more quickly by taking an angle which will bring it to the base of the block more quickly than if it had gone straight ahead. And then it returns to the original path that it took. A remarkable coincidence, if you like, of activity, which the physicist Richard Feynman was absolutely astounded by when he was confronted with this as a schoolboy in physics. He later used the principle of least action in his own research and very famously was awarded the Nobel Prize for it. So you can see that the principle of least action illustrates a lot of what is natural about nature. A fascinating characteristic of alluvial rivers is that they self-adjust. Now, I think we all use that term. This river is self-adjusting. It's getting wider because there's more water in it, or it's getting wider because the vegetation on the banks has been removed. The channel will self-adjust. If a channel is too wide to be stable, it will narrow. If it's too steep, it meanders or it braids too fast and it roughens its boundary. This is all self-adjustment. Now, I'm going to horrify you a bit by saying that that's not just self-adjustment. In short, rivers evolve. They evolve to minimize their action. And again, many of us use that term. We will say, oh, this river is evolving to develop meanders, or it's evolving to become steeper. As geomorphologists, we tend to use the term evolution of rivers in a rather colloquial way. Most of us have not previously meant that we're talking about something which is as fundamental as evolution is in the natural world, in the animal and plant kingdoms. They evolve to maximize their stability and hence maximize their efficiency. So rivers evolve in the same fundamental way that organisms do. Now you're going to be a bit surprised by that, as I said, because many of my colleagues found it difficult to accept that a river and an elephant or a river and a mouse had basically very much in common. But the two rivers on the left have simply evolved to adopt different planforms. There was nothing particularly unique which caused the braided river at the top. It had certain characteristics, amount of sediment, the amount of discharge, the gradient, and what happened was it iteratively evolved to form a braided channel. Of course, it had bars, and these bars migrated. It had variable discharge. It has all those things. But the river at the bottom, that's an example of a river which is iteratively evolved. It didn't have to have a big wide channel to move that gravel. It was moving presumably quite a large proportion of sand and fine sediment, and it has evolved to form a meandering channel. How many rivers do we have? Well, as I say in the dot point on the right, since the Carboniferous, we've got a very large number of organisms have evolved, but over the same period of time, relatively few rivers have evolved. So why so few rivers? As I say in the bottom dot point, there are supposed to be about 9 million extant species in the world today. If you counted all the extinct species, you might get into the billions, but there are about 9 million extant species and many more extinct species. What I'm suggesting here, the relationship, if you like, between rivers as physical systems and animals as organic systems isn't just unique to rivers, although Huang and I came up with this idea quite early on. It has been adopted more widely across a range of different fields. This paper was published in PNAS only 2 years ago. And if you look at the statement in the significance there, I'll read it out. The universe is replete with complex evolving systems, but the existence of macroscopic physical laws do not seem to adequately describe these systems. Now, that list of authors is a combination of chemists, astronomers, geochemists, and I think there's a social scientist amongst them as well. They're all saying that evolution, such as it occurs really in the plant and animal kingdoms, is very widespread across the physical and, in some cases, the social world as well. As I said, in geomorphology, it's been proposed that there are 4 basic river patterns. And it's been proposed that each of those had a separate cause. If you look at the literature, people write papers on river meanders and try to explain river meanders without mentioning braided rivers, or they mention anabranching rivers. People don't view them as a continuum, as a biologist would view the animal kingdom. Like a biologist wouldn't say there was a unique cause for whales, which is different to the unique cause, the unique cause for fishes. Fishes and whales have simply evolved over time. There is not a whale forming mechanism or a fish forming mechanism, just as there's not a meandering river mechanism or a braided river mechanism. They are all adjustments to evolve to a maximum state of energy efficiency. That diagram on the right, I'll bring it back to you again. While there are 9 million different species on the globe, there are only about 14 different types of rivers if you took that diagram into account. I'll come to why there are so few rivers shortly. Rivers have evolved, of course, but they haven't evolved into 9 million different types. I'm going to stick with the energy efficiency argument a little bit longer, using organisms to illustrate the point, because organisms are much better understood in terms of their evolution. Many of you will know, of course, the Galapagos Islands, just off your continent, and it's made up of a group of islands. And when Darwin first visited the islands, he recognized that there were about 10 different species of finches, all living on different islands. Now, they must have been one finch that blew to the Galapagos Islands, probably from the mainland of South America. And that one finch has evolved into those 10 different finch species. Each of those species is an illustration of efficiency. They each have a different shaped beak. And the important thing, if you're a finch on an island, is you've got to keep yourself alive. And the only way you can keep yourself alive is to be as efficient as possible, to be more efficient than any other finch and more efficient than any other bird that is also on that island that might like the same things you like. So there are a whole range of different beak characteristics there, which are entirely determined by the fact that each of those birds has to maximize its efficiency on a particular island. Why are there so many birds and why are there so many other organisms? Well, I'll explain that now. We have many more organisms than we have river patterns. Rivers don't compete with each other. They only compete with themselves. There's just one river per valley, and that river occupies a niche. That valley is its niche. A river becomes inefficient. It will evolve and rapidly replace itself to become more efficient. There are, however, relatively few niches that rivers need to occupy. In contrast, organisms must compete with their own species, and they have to compete with any other species that moves into their niche. And there are a vast number of niches. So the world of mammals, for example, consists of this vast number of mammals, all of which occupy slightly different niches. Whereas in the case of rivers, rivers can solve most of their problems, if you like, the difficulty in remaining stable and moving the sediment load that is supplied to them, by just developing 4 fairly basic river types. And that's what's illustrated in the bottom right diagram. I think Eduardo will have seen this diagram before, but I do like to point out that we're really reclaiming the theory of evolution. Evolution was developed in the earth sciences, the geological origin of the theory of evolution. In 1788, James Hutton published The Theory of the Earth, the first really logical scientific account of geology and why landscapes evolved, why mountains wore down to plains and then somehow magically grew back into mountains and then wore down into plains again. He didn't fully understand the process, but he did see that landscapes evolved. Charles Lyell, who was born the year that James Hutton died, he captured those ideas of Hutton and greatly popularized them. He talked about evolving coastlines and evolving rivers and evolving hillsides. So he had a good grasp of the concept of evolution. Now, Lyell was Charles Darwin's mentor. Lyell was an older man than Darwin, and they were both members of the Royal Society. And Darwin was undoubtedly influenced by the ideas of Charles Lyell. He took those 2 volumes, The Principles of Geology, on the Beagle when he sailed around the world. And in his letter to his friend Leonard Horner, Darwin wrote, "I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brains, and that I never acknowledge this sufficiently. Nor do I know how I can without saying so in so many words." Darwin is really saying a lot of my ideas and my concept of evolution really came from Charles Lyell. I'm not sure that Charles Lyell was quite so generous. He didn't necessarily attribute his ideas to James Hutton, but there definitely was a pathway there. Now, I wasn't going to give you any mathematics, but there's a little bit of an equation here just to illustrate the point that we do, in fact, we are able to establish where this ideal position of the pendulum lies in a river. See on the left-hand side white diagram there, you've got the pendulum swinging backwards and forwards, but having a single position of stationary equilibrium. That's why it's called stationary equilibrium. The pendulum, of course, still has energy. I mean, it's suspended above the surface. It could drop to the surface, but it's held in position in a stationary fashion. On the right-hand diagram, that's the specific energy diagram. And some of you familiar with hydraulics will be aware of that. I mean, basically, that illustrates that river channels, or flowing water, not river channels, just flowing water, has an optimum state. It has a state of minimum energy. And that's why rivers develop those standing waves. When they become too fast and the flow is too excessive, standing waves will impede the energy. When there's too much energy, they roughen their bed to remove the excessive energy. Rivers are attracted to that central line through the data set there, and the rivers will adjust their bed, their flow, their standing waves in order to try and achieve that optimum state, just as the pendulum does on the left, eventually swing to that optimum position. We can illustrate that with rivers, with that little equation in there. Take the right-hand side of the equation. What that's saying is that there is a relationship between the shear stress in a river and the critical shear stress. How much greater is the shear in a river than the critical shear, in other words? How much sediment will that river move because its shear stress is greater than the shear stress for sediment just sitting on the bed? And if you express that as a ratio of the wetted perimeter, and that's the wetted perimeter, that symbol there that's illustrated as the wetted perimeter symbol. Now, in both cases, you put the ratio of shear stress over the ratio of the wetted perimeter minus the optimum wetted perimeter. The optimum wetted perimeter is 2. The river channel with a wetted perimeter of 2 has the smallest boundary for the volume of water that will flow down it. It'll have banks and bed and a bank with a wetted perimeter over the area of that cross section of 2. And that comes out in a river which is in optimum state, will come out to that ratio of 0.3. I've often asked Huang, what does 0.3 mean? And he doesn't know. Basically, it's just the optimum ratio of those two relationships, the relationship between the amount of shear stress that a river has and the shape of the channel cross-section. That really defines the efficiency of a river, the optimum efficiency being 0.3. For those of you who are keen on the mathematics, I've given the paper there. I presume you'll keep a copy of this, Eduardo, so people can access the diagrams and the references as well. So that reference will be there. And I wasn't involved in this research. This was done by Huang, my colleague Huang, and Howard Chang at Santa Barbara University. And they developed that relationship there. It's very easy to use in rivers. It's a very simple equation, the right-hand side there. You could apply it to just about any river you have in Brazil, and you could determine what its relationship is and how close it is to 0.3. We're supposed to be publishing a paper along those lines shortly, but at the moment, that's the paper, the one that's in the center at the bottom there that I'd refer you to. Okay, taking this efficiency into account and trying to combine our ideas of evolution with animals, and there we've got an elephant in the top right-hand corner and a mouse in the bottom left-hand corner. We can, in fact, line rivers up in terms of how much energy they have. The most energetic river is in the top right-hand corner, and those are what is called step pools. You'd only find those up in the Andes, where the river is bouncing down a series of rock waterfalls and plunge pools. It's a highly turbid river, a lot of energy. As the diagram there suggests, greater than about 1,000 watts per square metre. The energy is consumed in that river by a series of step pools and boulders that obstruct the flow. But as the energy diminishes as you come out of the mountains, it doesn't need to be such a dramatically resistant channel. It adopts that illustration, the next one, which is a braided river. There are the braid bars. That channel, of course, is just about empty. It's just running very low flow. But at bank full flow, that bed would be made up of thousands of braid bars, all of which are like bed forms. We don't call them bed forms, we call them bars, but they're basically behaving in the same way as bed forms. They're resisting the flow. They're holding back the energy that river has. If you move on to the next diagram, to the left, you've got a meandering river, like many of the rivers in the Amazon basin. Once you move away from the Andes, the rivers like the Madeira and those, they develop a distinctly meandering pattern. And that's because they've got excess energy. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to meander. The excess energy generates the meanders. But they don't have so much energy that they need step pools, and they don't have so much energy that they need braid bars. And then you get to the optimum state, those rivers with an H number of 0.3, the optimum state. Here in Australia, illustrated on that diagram in the top left corner, those are anabranching rivers or anabranching channels. And the diagram on the bottom right, the white diagram, it shows the step pools ones are steep, and then you lower the gradient and you get into a stable form of braided, although they're still incisional. And then you get down to a stable form of meandering, which is still incisional. Meandering rivers are just about all incisional. And then you get to that black line, which is the very thin group of rivers, very few of them, which are at stationary equilibrium. And once you drop below stationary equilibrium, you get to an unusual situation where rivers have insufficient energy. They're very uncommon. I can't think of a good example in Brazil that I could tell you about. Eduardo may know some, but almost the only rivers that get to that point are the deltas of rivers. That is, when they get to the point where they can transport their sediment no further and they become unstable and vertically accrete, or prograde, as the delta does. And they are essentially non-stable rivers. And they're the ones that I pointed out before in Iceland. That braided pattern is quite a famous outlet from a glacier in Iceland, which is a grading. And of course, you've got the rapidly aggrading anabranching channels, as you've got in the Columbia River. Okay, we're getting towards the end of the talk. I want to draw your attention to Australia because, as I said, moving to Australia revealed a great deal about rivers that had never occurred to me when I was living in New Zealand or working in Canada and attending conferences in Europe and so forth. The Australian plate is unique in that regard because it has a lot of rivers on it which are atypical to those in the rest of the world. Let's look at these rivers on the right-hand side of this diagram. What you've got are the rivers of New Zealand. Now, New Zealand is tectonically very active, and it's right in the path of the westerlies, what are sometimes called the Roaring Forties, which also impact the coast of Chile in South America. It's a very wet environment, and it's got a lot of river activity, and it's got a lot of tectonics. And so you've got high mountains there, uplift rates of somewhere between 6 and 12 millimeters a year, staggeringly high uplift rates. Those rivers are struggling. They're vastly overpowered, and they're very steep. When you move up to New Guinea, we'll leave Australia for last. When you move up to New Guinea is tectonically active too, but it's not on a subduction zone of the type that New Zealand is on and going up at 5 to 10 to 12 millimetres a year. New Guinea's highlands are probably rising at 1 or 2 millimetres a year, but much of the country is in fact rising much less quickly. And its rivers are like many rivers in the Amazon basin. They're meandering. The foreland of New Guinea has these meandering rivers all over it. And that's because they've got not a vast amount of energy, but they've got too much energy to be straight. And then you go round to the left-hand side of the diagram where the sun shines a lot and the plains are very flat. There's almost no tectonism. And I've shown you two examples there of non-anabranching rivers, which are almost dead straight. Those are two examples of rivers in Australia which have adopted a straight planform. You can see they're totally different to what you have. The rivers in New Zealand are often straight, but they're straight and very wide, and they're braided. Australia does not have a single braided river. It's a continent of 7.7 million square kilometres and not a single braided river on it, because it doesn't have the tectonic energy and it doesn't have the climatic energy to drive braiding. Just to make the point, here are the rivers in New Guinea when they get towards the sea. Those highly meandering rivers that I showed you in the previous slide for New Guinea suddenly straighten when they get to the ocean. And why are they straightening? Well, because they've no longer got excess energy. They're trying to move their very considerable fine sediment load into the ocean. And so the meanders stop and the straight reaches start. And you can see those three deltas there have almost dead straight channels because meandering is no longer required. These rivers are now moving their sediment as efficiently as possible into the ocean. They don't have excess energy. And this is really the sort of culminating diagram for river patterns and the way they behave. This diagram, the solid line through the middle of it reads stationary equilibrium. So that's where the pendulum, if you like, is dead center and not moving. That's the most efficient river channel that you can have, where it's using the least amount of energy to move the sediment load that's supplied to it. But if you took in the top left corner, you've got New Zealand's rivers, which are these braided rivers where there's a great deal of energy, over 1,000 watts per square meter, perhaps reducing to about 50 to 300 watts as they become a little bit sinuous and have less braid bars in them, and then reducing to perhaps 10 to 60 watts per square meter when you get into the New Guinea rivers, which are mostly meanders and have almost no braid bars. And then you get to the Australian rivers, which have very low powers, generally about 5 watts per square meter. So there's a progression of rivers. You could view that progression as like you have in Brazil, if you took the rivers in New Zealand representing those at the foot of the Andes and having an abundance of energy. You could then take the rivers as you move out into the Amazon basin and they start to meander. And then you get to those rivers that Eduardo's been working on, which are anabranching, and where the channels, and I was looking today on Google Earth, the channels on those rivers are remarkably straight. Now below that line, you've got two rivers that are drawn in there. They're the two examples that I showed you in previous photographs, which are underpowered rivers and vertically accreting. I did say to you before that braided rivers are made up of two types of braided river. The one on the bottom diagram is braided, but it's in Iceland and it's degrading. The one on the top diagram on the left is braided. It's in New Zealand and it's incising. That paper by Jamansky and Shum, published in 1993, is the only paper I know of which has ever attempted to even identify the fact that braided rivers both A-grade and D-grade. In a lot of cases, they were thought to be just degrading systems, having too much sediment in them. But Henderson, the engineer in New Zealand, quite a famous engineer, hydraulic engineer, demonstrated that many of New Zealand's rivers are braided because they have too much energy. So that diagram is a kind of summary diagram that I would say replaces that diagram I showed you that has 14 different types of rivers. What we're showing here is a continuum of rivers from braided right through to anabranching. So to bring the rivers part to a close, there's no specific mechanism that causes a river to evolve. Or a different one that will cause it to braid, or another one that will cause it to anabranch. These are just simply adjustments. In the same way, there was nothing that caused an elephant to be an elephant. There's nothing that caused a mouse to be a mouse. They are simply a product of evolution. They are simply a product of maximizing their efficiency. These patterns are all energy-consuming evolutionary adjustments, iterative adjustments on a planet, with the exception of Australia, that has too much energy to allow rivers to adopt straight, least action stationary pathways. The self-adjustment of alluvial rivers is the evolution of alluvial rivers. We should really use those two terms in a much more accepting way, that we are dealing with something here which is clearly evolutionary and not just some vague concept of self-adjustment. Now, in my abstract, I did say that I would explain why the Earth has an extremely biased sedimentary record. I've corresponded at some length with sedimentologists, and a good mate of mine who I did quite a lot of field work with was Martin Gibbling, who I'm quoting on the right-hand side of that diagram, Gibbling 2006. Now, a lot of sedimentologists have realized that river meanders are the most common pattern on Earth. Luna Leopold wrote it in a paper that they dominate, I can't remember the percentage, but something like 80% of the rivers he observed were meandering. Sedimentologists have been frustrated looking at the globe's fluvial stratigraphy and not finding meandering river stratigraphy. And they've set about trying to find it. And in fact, they have found some, because of course there will always be some examples of a particular feature. But if you look at Gibbling's statement there, or his observation, in a compilation of all the papers he could find in 2006, he showed that meandering stratigraphies were mostly less than 20 meters thick, and they were only sort of 1 to 3 stories thick, that is, one layer put on top of another layer, put on top of another layer. And they were only about 2 kilometers in lateral extent. A very small part of the entire global record is made up of meandering rivers. And yet someone has tried to construct a diagram in between, or just to the right of the cross that I put there, that diagram of stratigraphy, suggests that you can get multiple layers of meandering river. I'll explain why you don't in a minute, but the second diagram shows braided rivers. Now, braided rivers do form, they're not very common around the globe. If you look at the Amazon basin, you can find them up in the headwaters, but there are very few braided rivers over most of the Amazon basin and very few braided rivers over most basins. But by far the most common stratigraphic signature comes from braided rivers. Gibbling showed that braided river stratigraphies were mostly greater than 50 meters thick. Some were over 1 kilometer in thickness, and they were tens of stories thick. That is, there were many stories stacked one on top of the other, and they were up to 100 kilometers in width. Where I live here in Australia, we have a very extensive braided river system of Triassic age. The rock escarpment behind the university is made up of Triassic sandstone, and it extends for about 100 kilometers. So you've got these two very different sorts of stratigraphy? Well, that's because braided rivers, for the most part, are underpowered. And the only sort of rivers that are going to be represented in the stratigraphic record are those that leave their sediment behind. And those that leave their sediment behind are underpowered rivers. Why don't meandering rivers leave their sediment behind? Well, they're overpowered. They meander because they've got too much energy. If they've got too much energy, they're not going to leave sediment behind. They're in fact eroding sediment. For the most part, meanders are either fairly rapidly incising or very gradually incising. The meanders have been developed with the extra power that the river has, and the meander bends migrate, the sediment gets moved through the system, and as the bends migrate, the river forms a new set of bends at a slightly lower level, and on it goes. People have tried to draw illustrations, and this one here on the left is as an example. See, just at the bottom of that braided river, it says older lateral accretion complex. That's because sedimentologists want it to be there. They're not actually there in reality. Almost never do you find meandering rivers in stratigraphy. There are some examples, because when stratigraphies like braided rivers come to the end of their life, when the amount of sediment being deposited declines, then often the top part of the sequence, the stratigraphic sequence, will have too much energy because the sediment load has disappeared and the river will start to meander. And so some stratigraphies, and these have been described, have meanders at the top of them. The other place that you will find meanders is in tidal rivers, grading tidal rivers. But what happens there is you have to have sea level rising in order to preserve the stratigraphy. So they too are very uncommon. Okay, well, that's really the end of the talk, and I just draw your attention to the two papers that basically this talk comes from. You can find these at your leisure. I think they're pretty readily available. One's in geomorphology and the other is in Earth surface processes. And they run through in considerable detail the topics and ideas that I've been expressing here. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cheryl, for such a wonderful talk. I think it makes us, all of us, to reflect about all these issues. I would like to invite the public to ask questions. We don't have yet questions in the comments. Please write your questions so we can discuss with Cheryl about these issues. It's a big opportunity for all the people that is participating to make questions to Cheryl.
Yeah, don't worry about how, if you like, silly you think your question is, because I've been fairly provocative in talking about evolution and animals and rivers, and the whole concept of evolution is sometimes quite difficult to grasp. I happened to do a double major. I did a major in zoology and a major in geomorphology. So I ended up having quite a good background in evolution. But a lot of geomorphologists don't think about evolution. They worry about things like DNA. Surely genes are important for evolution. DNA is important, etc. Well, it is important for the evolution of organisms, but there are lots of reasons I could go into and explain why DNA isn't important in understanding why rivers evolve.
Absolutely. I will retake this issue with you, Gerald, in more detail. Please, more questions from the participants. We have one already.
Right.
But it's more specifics on a specific case. Let's see if we have more, so we can combine some questions. The point is that what you say. Well, let's answer this question here. You can read it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, is there climate change, anthropogenic change? Also, well, it's what you say, this is dependent on the hydrological regime, etc. Can you answer this, Gerald?
Yeah, well, sorry, what was the question?
It's writing in the screen. If
No.
future hydrological change due to climate change or anthropogenic changes induce higher peak flows volumes, could that affect the current equilibrium of a river?
No, I haven't got anything writing on my screen.
Okay. So it's asking see if
if you read it out, I'll try and answer it.
Yeah. Okay. Can you answer?
Yeah, sorry, what was the question?
Yes. If future hydrological changes due to climate change or anthropogenic change induce higher peak flows, could that affect the current equilibrium of a river?
Yes, great. Can you hear me? Yes, greatly. What I'm doing here and what Huang and I are doing is really trying to understand rivers at their most fundamental. It's another layer of complexity trying to work out what climate change will do, especially if discharges are going to, for example, increase greatly as they might in parts of Brazil, or decrease as they might in many areas of Australia. There's going to be another whole research project, if you like, looking at what we're talking about here on rivers which are undergoing significant hydrological changes. At this stage, we're really just trying to get the basic nuts and bolts together as to how rivers behave, whether they're braided, meandering, antibranching, why they do these things. We might then be in a better position to say what will happen. Well, is the river likely to antibranch? Is it likely to braid? Is it likely to meander? Once we get a real understanding of why they do in the first place.
Okay. So we have another question now, but welcome, Jorge. Jorge Abad is present here. Remember Jorge from Iquitos field trip and meeting Gerald, that we met him. Jorge working in the Amazon. So Jorge is asking us, living organisms evolve changing environment, geographic settings, while rivers are settled in a specific location and dominant parameters change around the river. Is a specific type of evolution?
Okay, that's a good question.
In the comments, I don't know. Are you access to the questions, Gerald, that are appearing in the screen?
No, I don't see anything appearing on the screen. I've still got my picture in front of me. Can I get rid of this? Shall I say end slideshow?
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, okay.
I'm afraid maybe we can get some problem of connection, so you change it. But
no, I can see the questions now.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. George has asked this. Yeah, living organisms evolve. Yeah. Changing environments, geographically, while rivers are settled in specific locations and dominant parameters change around the river. Is it a specific type of evolution? Well, I suppose it is a specific type. We're not saying that everything evolves the same way. I showed you that paper, and it might be worth having a look at that paper that was published in PNAS, because they're really saying that evolution covers pretty well the whole of the universe. We started off in a universe that was made up of hydrogen and helium, and now we have how many different elements in the periodic table? I mean, what's happened is that all those elements have evolved. We're talking about planets, all of which have evolved. and we're talking about rivers that have evolved. So it's the same evolution, but it's certainly very different to what happens with animals. I mentioned in passing, about DNA, about RNA and DNA. And I've had it said to me, well, you have to have those to have evolution. Well, you don't. RNA and DNA are actually designed to prevent evolution. If you didn't have those in organisms would simply interbreed and you'd only have one organism. So when organisms are capable of interbreeding, it means that you have to be able to genetically separate them so that a horse and a tiger can't interbreed, and you keep the horse and the tiger. In the case of rivers only have to compete with themselves. So a drainage basin has a particular river in it, and whether that river is efficient when there's a glacier at the head of the valley, or whether it's efficient as a graded river, or whether it's efficient as a meandering river, will determine what that river adopts, depending on what is happening to it. So the mechanisms, if you like, are totally different to what's happening in the animal and plant kingdom. But the changes that are taking place are evolution. They are changes which are designed to maximize the efficiency of the system, be it the efficiency of the horse or the efficiency of the elephant or the efficiency of the meandering river. And the meandering river will change to a braided river if that's the more efficient of the two.
Yeah, and I believe also that the point is that the river is not just one track, right? So the adaptation or the evolution can be in different regions, different location in the same organism that should be the river.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that's the difference with the one single animal or once, because we are talking about one animal, we are talking about communities or whatever. So what you say, we can move this toward different senses even in biology, in terms of hierarchies. But basically it's that, right? So the environment is also imposing conditions and different time scales. So the river has to evolve in function of the different kind of issues and changes that is or factors that are imposing in these conditions, right?
Yes, well, you can think of a river, for example, as the Mississippi, which started off, one is led to believe, as a braided river during the last glacial. It would have been a braided river running out to the, what do we call it these days, the Gulf of Mexico still? Anyway, we'll stick with that one. And that has evolved just as the vegetation in the catchment evolved as that river changed. So there was an awful lot of evolution going on, an awful lot of ecological change. The ecology, ecosystems evolve as well. That is, the organisms don't evolve, but the actual composition of organisms evolves. And that's really what you're saying, is that the river itself can adopt a very different pattern over time or over length. If you take the rivers in the Andes, in the Amazon, yes, they evolve, if you like, downstream from braided to meandering to anabranching, and then their final, in their final reaches, they consist of very straight channels. So I think we're being somewhat limited by thinking about evolution the way we have with animals and plants.
If you allow me a comment, is regarding, for example, Jorge Abad question, living organisms evolve, changing environment or geographical setting and rivers in a specific location. Is what we say. We have to put all in context because we include both the time scale of this particular important point that good part of the present day, the guys working on present day processes or morphodynamics that we know are not considering too much these issues in terms of evolution of natural systems through time. Like the example that you provided on the Mississippi is a very classical one. But also that what I always discuss with the school of American school, for example, that is mainly basic on physics. They want to apply what you presented in your slide. It's like a physical explanation for everything, right? They are looking for that, just like processes. And this is an important point because I practically never saw two rivers that are identical, right? Because the evolution also the setting where the river developed and the history of this place through time produce specific conditions that are not exactly the same in another place. So the center you provided from Australia, well, this uniqueness of this landscape and this geological situation and climatic situation, when we compare, okay, let's compare forests, but it's not the same. Let's compare mountains, they are not the same. So the final products are similar, but not identical, right? And again, this is linked to this way of thinking. Why the people can reject, why you are talking about evolutionary patterns? We have to play on with the physical processes and explanations. It's not excluded. You can explain these kind of issues. You are still explaining processing with physics, nothing to do with that. But it's not a factor that exclude understanding in a different way, like you are proposing, River, as well. I think this is a major point that we have to consider, Gerald. For example, you mentioned as well, when you are talking about evolution, we can see animals through evolution, but we can see differently through DNA, right? Because you mentioned before. So, well, yeah, DNA should be like looking rivers only in terms of physical processes, universal laws, right? But we are not going to understand an elephant and the evolution of the elephant just with DNA, right? I think this is the point of that we have to consider. And I always discuss this with the landscapes. We cannot understand landscapes because they have an history, right? I don't understand a person with DNA. I understand the person with the whole history of this person and the social, environmental factors that shape this person and so on. It's not just a product of just a DNA analysis are going to solve it, right? The same with the landscape and rivers.
So you're really saying that you can study rivers through time? Is that what you're suggesting? Because the stratigraphic record is what we use, and you can, as you showed us in the Amazon, you've got terraces with one form of river in the terraces, and you've got the present Amazon as another form of river. It's presumably evolved from one type to another over quite long periods of time. So we do have a history. We can see the evolution having taken place, and we can also understand why that evolution took place in the same way that we know that woolly mammoths lost their wool because things got warmer. We can understand why braided rivers changed into meandering rivers when the amount of sediment load and the discharges that came off the ice sheet and everything else changed. So it's a very predictable process, just as predictable really as understanding the evolution of woolly mammoths, the mammoths to elephants, from understanding braided rivers to meandering rivers.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we have more questions. Please go ahead. Don't be shy. It's a great opportunity for us to discuss these issues. Thank you, Jorge, for your question. More questions, please. Let's give a second so maybe we can get another one. But anyway, this is a fascinating topic. I really appreciate, Gerald, you accepted our invitation. We are living a time where people is just focusing on generating big data and tools, right?
I'm going to send you a paper that I just read today in sort of preparation for the talk. I thought, and it was just staggering. It was like one of those papers you've just mentioned about the physics and how people make assumptions and how they're trying to explain the purely physical operation of a river. Now, it involves one of your rivers. I've forgotten the name of it now, but I'll send you the paper. And the argument is that this meandering river is vertically accreting at 10 meters. A meandering river is vertically accreting at 10 meters, 100 years in the Amazon basin. I mean, how this stuff gets published, I don't know, but this is a paper that's published in Water Resources Research, and I'll send it to you. I've just illustrated why meandering rivers can't vertically accrete, and this fellow's talking about them accreting 10 meters. I mean, there are people live along that river. If it accreted at 10 meters, 100 years, whole villages would be buried. Whole forests would disappear. If this stuff gets published. So it'll be interesting to see what your comments are when I send it to you.
Share it with me. I didn't see that one.
Yeah.
Well, I think we don't have more questions, Gerald. What I was mentioning is, well, we have more and more papers only, processing data and geotools and geospatial stuff. And I think that we got this opportunity with you to create this reflection. So we need to teach our students to think about concepts and theories and foundations on our science, and not just to repeat and produce just a product, right? So I think it's very, very important for all the people that participated today, getting your insights on these topics. Thank you very much, Gerald.
All the best, Eduardo. Pleasure. And pity we didn't get the photography working better, but it was good to be able to give the talk anyway.
Thank you. Well, let's say we are going to finish our transmission now. Thank you to everybody, and we will continue with the next seminar in December with Peng Gao from the Syracuse University. That should be our next talk. Thank you. Bye.
All the best. Okay. Bye now.
Fica por aqui. Boa semana.